So today we're going to be doing so highlights about the debate and with a little bit more focus on the contingency argument. So we had a debate, yourself and Muhammad Hijab against Colin and Cosmic Skeptic, about Islam and atheism, which better explains reality. And today we would just want to go over some of the points which I think were sort of missed during the post-debate and discussions and, the all the other interactions which happened afterwards. So,
thanks for having me on. And it was a very interesting debate, a title which is not really, you don't see often, which is not just Islam or atheism, which makes more sense or what have you, but more it's Islam or atheism which explains reality better.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you're evaluating them as two kind of theories about the world and looking at which one matches or fits or explains the world better, is more coherent, consistent, and doesn't have any contradictions within itself or in its explanation of the world or reality generally. So that was a very interesting debate, but like all debates, it started off with the first debate, which is on a mini debate, you could say, which is what is atheism and how do you define it? And I knew that certain objections would be raised from the atheist side, which is that atheism, they'd say, isn't a position, it's just a lack of belief. And so you can't really compare the two. And I kind of tried to preempt that by kind of saying, well, look, the universal reality has, let's say there are many competing explanations currently in the world today. So what does atheism, what its minimum is, it doesn't believe in God. But the corollary of that, so the implication of that, is that an atheist could be perfectly happy positing that there is no God and that the universe can be explained without God. And that is then a particular claim they have to hold to. If they say the universe can be explained better with a God, then they'd have to adopt that as at least the best hypothesis that they can come up with. So the very fact they've chosen to not believe in God is that that posits that they think that the best explanation for reality is that there can't be a God, or there isn't a God. And that's basically where the argument came. So I came up by saying, this is the claim that you are making. You're saying that you can explain reality better without God. And he tried to bring a analogy from a colleague of his, Matt Dillahunty.
The gumball.
Yeah. So he said that, let's say there's a jar of gumballs, and one person says there must be a odd number of gumballs in that jar, and the response would be, well, how do you know? You're just guessing. But at the same time, they would say, and Alex would say that, well, he's not going to say there's an even number of gumballs. He's just, in essence, in a way, agnostic as to how many gumballs are in the jar. Yeah. And this is really a kind of a false analogy in this case.
Yeah,
because
I felt that.
Because basically, we're not debating as to how big the universe is, or how old the universe is, how much time is it, or how many levels of substratum are there underneath the universe. So we have obviously the macro world we live in, and then we have obviously the atomic world, and then the subatomic and what have you. How many levels are there? We're not debating this. We're not saying how many gumballs are there. The debate are, in essence, if to use an equivalent, would be, do gumballs exist? Right? Yeah. In essence, and it's not rather, or does the jar exist, or does the one who made the gumballs exist, which is more pertinent in this particular case. Yeah? So is there a maker of gumballs? And that is the real debate. And of course, you'd have to conclude there is, irrespective of how many gumballs there are.
So what's interesting, I find, it's not just Cosmic Skeptic. I've seen this with Matt Dillahunty and others, that when they are with their own people on YouTube in lectures, they're very clear that they do not believe in God. And they actually make the comparison between God and the spaghetti monster. So for them, the belief in God is just out there. It's just, they reject it. Yet when they come and they actually have a debate, they don't want to defend that position. So they say, well, we're not saying there is no God. We lack of belief in God. So with the gumball analogy, it's kind of like, we're not saying odd or even, we just don't know. But if you're going to come to a debate and you're going to say that, then what you should have done is not accepted the title, because the title is explicitly clear that it's either Islam or atheism, which is it better explains reality. So if you accepted the title, that means you've accepted the burden, that you need to provide how atheism makes sense of reality better than Islam, and the Muslim side has to do the opposite. And if you go into the debate and in the beginning, like Alex did, and basically just use that analogy, at that point, I mean, I was there at the debate, it was just like, you could basically tell this is a very powerful psychological sort of analogy, right? It's just like, oh, we're just, just, we don't really, from their point of view, the job psychologically is a lot easier, because for them it's like, well, we just need to take pot shots at your worldview. We don't need to do anything. We're just, by default, we're covered. When in actual fact, it's game on. You have to provide, evidence for your worldview. I have to provide evidence for my worldview, and we're going to battle it out. But when he actually did that in the debate, I just felt, I expected better, because and it was just one of those things that we've seen before with other atheists. We've seen before in other debates as well, and they need to be consistent, because at the end of the day, they are speaking on YouTube. They are speaking on platforms that everybody has access to. And you can tell the clear discrepancy between the debates, in which they don't want to defend that view, and publicly when they speak, they're very clear there is no God. Yeah.
Well, I feel it's a strategy, and I'm not speaking to any one particular intentions, but there's a strategy that if you don't have a solid position in a debate, then all you can do is attack the other person without any risk of you being refuted, right? So it's like Bruce Lee said, be water, right? Because you can't punch water, or you just go right through. Your fist won't actually impact with anything that's so solid. So, in essence, if they represent as just being agnostic, and they say, well, I don't make any claims, and then therefore, if the most that could be said is we don't know, and if it's we don't know, then you default to our position.
Yes.
Right? And that was the strategy they came up with. Whereas I tried to, and I kind of, in a way, tried to pin them down by saying, well, look, the corollary by necessity is that you believe that the universe can be explained without God. That is something that you have to claim. You have to posit. If you say that, you don't say that, then you should the only position you can then say in that debate is that Islam or atheism explains reality equally the same. Like God or no God, reality is equally explained. They didn't actually come to that with that particular angle. And the what we're kind of discussing was that if you insist there's no God, and hence my strategy was to show that if you insist that there's no God, so there's no first cause who willed things to exist purely without any prior prerequisite kind of motivations forcing him to, or any other mechanisms making him do it, but he purely willed out of choice. If you don't believe in that concept, then the universe doesn't make sense, or at least you can't explain its cause. You come up with contradictions to explain why it even exists in the first place.
There's consequences of holding your belief. That's what you're basically trying to say to them. You can't just say, look, it's a lack of belief. That lack of a belief has consequences, and those consequences are contradictions. Okay, so that was the first point about what is atheism, and I think that was very important. Now, an important I would say with most viewers of the debate, for some reason or the other, the title of the debate got lost, right? So it was about explaining reality, and I felt that when the atheist side went into niche topics to do with moral issues, what did you think at that point in the debate? Because you must have been like, if I was in your position, I'd be like, well, we're trying to talk about the big stuff here. Why are you bringing up stuff which we can speak about much later on?
Well, I was a little surprised, although to an extent, that Cosmic Skeptic would kind of start to bring up moral argument to say, look, there are certain aspects of Islam, some of its ideas go against the morals or the particular moral tastes that you might hold as an audience member living in the West, for example. So if you find that something against your taste, then you can't accept Islam. And that is
poor argument.
That's an extremely poor argument. It's an irrational argument, because who says that reality has to conform to the moral tastes of a particular people living in a particular civilization in a particular part of the Earth's crust, in a particular solar system, in the great universe, right? It's kind of ridiculous. So I was I decided not to entertain the question deliberately. If we were going to have a debate as to is Islam more humane than, let's say, secular humanism or types of liberalism, then we can discuss that. But this discussion, it was really irrelevant because reality, I mean, and I try to kind of raise this, is there's a difference between, as David Hume explained, is and ought, right? So what is different to what ought to be, right? So they're different categories. So that the discussion we were having was about explaining what is. What ought comes as a consequence after we first kind of discuss, well, what does exist, and then we can discuss, well, if God exists and then he's given obligations upon different creation, and we are one of those creation, then we can discuss ought. But to start this premise as that, well, I'm going to just take arbitrarily what people think ought to be and then make that the basis of deciding what is kind of, it's irrational.
I mean, I can see why he did that. It works, firstly, because a lot of people aren't going to notice that. A lot of people, they don't, even with the title, they don't understand that we're actually speaking about these very big things. And when you just bring that up, it's a very emotive issue, and you completely distract what the other side is actually speaking about. Now, in terms of the contingency argument, I think one of the feelings I had after the debate and after, seeing the comments and the reviews from the atheist side as well, is that what was lost is what was the crux of the Islamic side's argument, which is the contingency argument. And if anything, the post-debate discussion should have been about that. So I want to begin off on that. So firstly, could you sort of summarize the argument? What was the main argument from our side?
Okay, so the contingency argument just really posits that there are two types of things that could possibly be contingent and incontingent things. So contingent things are that which depend on something else. So either something that comes before them, a displacement of a different position before them, so movement, i.e. so to get from, so if you see something moving from arriving at B from A, what preceded it was A. So it depended on being on A first before arriving at B. That's movement. Of course, if something has particular characteristics, so for example, if a house or this building has particular characteristics, like for example, it is solid, it has certain mass, what have you. You could say, well, that's because of its the smaller components it's made out of, and then the question is, well, what gives those smaller components their qualities? And then because it's something made out of something smaller and smaller and smaller. So the question is, if that goes on forever, then how can it actually exist? Because to say that it goes on forever, so let's just say that there was an infinite amount of time before let's say we started this program, would we ever start this program? Would you exhaust infinity? If we had to wait an infinite amount of time before this program ends, would this program even finish? Riveting though it might be, but it can't go on forever. So there's that. And then of course, if something is made out of an infinite amount of smaller and smaller things, then what gives it its qualities? And to make an analogy, I tried to use an analogy during the debate, which was, if we look at a pool, we see a pool, we can't see the depth of it, we can't see the bottom of it. So I could say, well, it has a bottom. It's the bottom, the water's being held up at a certain level, there's a bottom somewhere. So the equivalent of the argument I was kind of hearing from Alex or Cosmic Skeptic in his first presentation, which he tried to kind of make a rebuttal to my opening presentation, was that he's not going to say how deep that pool is, right? And that's the wiser way, because to say it has a certain depth if you can't see it is to make an assumption. And I agree. If we saw this hypothetical pool, to say that it goes down to 80 meters or 200 meters or 400 meters, that would be assumption. But what isn't an assumption is that it has a bottom somewhere. Yeah. And not because I know that the earth has a certain diameter and it can only be that deep. No, because the water is being held up at a certain level, which means that the water molecules on top depend on the water molecules underneath them to hold them up, depend on the ones beneath them. And because then they're not...
Can't go back forever.
Yeah, it can't go down forever because it's being held up. If there was no bottom, it would all fall down. So I'm not saying how deep the pool is. Merely, I'm saying that I know for certain that there is a bottom to that pond. And that's basically the contingency argument, to use an analogy kind of expressed.
Sure. I mean, I've seen quite a few of Alex's videos, and I think that, firstly, I expected a lot more from him. But I think he was maybe expecting the Kalam cosmological argument, and I think it took him it took him by surprise maybe that we used the contingency argument. But what did you think about the way that he tried to respond to that and the sort of interaction between Muhammad Hijab and Alex about contingent things and necessary beings?
I mean, I can't speak for Alex's intent, but what his actions suggested, firstly in his opening presentation, which was part rebuttal, he devoted part of that to rebutting my opening presentation because he came after me, was he was expecting a kind of Kalam cosmological argument, a la, Alan and Craig,
William Lane
Craig, a different Craig. William Lane Craig. So he basically expected me to assert the premise that the universe began to exist, and therefore, all things that begin to exist have a cause. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And I didn't start out from that because I know, and I stated it during that debate when I corrected him, saying that he's arguing a straw man. He's arguing against an argument I'm not bringing up, which is that if I said that the universe began to exist without explaining why I know that's for certain, then he would just say, I'm just assuming, I'm asserting it, it's an assumption, and he rejects that assumption, and therefore my argument falls down. So I said, look, I didn't use this argument in the first place, so I don't know why you're using this, saying that I said it in essence, putting words into my mouth.
I found that really surprising because he's not. I mean, he's a very intelligent guy. You can tell, right? He's studying at Oxford, doing theology or something, philosophy. You wouldn't expect him to do that. It was just like me asking, how's your day? And you say, I don't like stamp collecting. I just found it bizarre that he tried to take the contingency argument, which is a distinct argument, a well-known argument, and try to, bring in causality and bring in, the beginning of the universe, try and refute it from something that he has prepared for, which is the Kalam cosmological argument. I felt that, sometimes in a debate, if, for example, you bring up an issue which I don't really have an answer for, rather than just not speaking much, I might as well just say something. So I might as well refute something in my head, right? So there was a bit of that going on. There's a bit of filler. So in terms of the actual discussion going back and forth between Muhammad Hijab and Alex about necessary beings, contingent beings, and not to get too much into detail about Muhammad Hijab quoting Alex and then going back and forth on that, but what was his main point that he was trying to make, Alex, in terms of this argument?
Well, I felt he was doing this defense, the agnostic defense, which is we don't know, you don't know, therefore by default you must not believe in a God because you don't know there is a God, and you can't believe in something without knowing or have evidence for some degree, which is a bit unclear because one also could say, well, look, even if you don't know for certain there's a God, there's evidence for one, right? It's a valid hypothesis if it wasn't something certain. Or do I posit it is certain because it's the only possible explanation that avoids contradiction, which was my argument. I tried to avoid philosophical jargon only because audience and many people watching it just switch off and so on and so forth. And I try to make it kind of like plain English.
Yeah, so sorry to interject, Abdullah, but when he asked you to put it into a syllogism, right? I was just a bit like, Abdullah's broken it down in a very simple way. And I don't know, did you feel he just didn't get it? He didn't get the argument, or was he just buying time? What do you think he was doing?
I mean, I can't speak for his intentions or motivations. All I can say is that I presented the argument in, you could say, natural language, and it was not ambiguous. It didn't use equivocation fallacies where you use one word with one meaning and then use it again with a different sense implied from that word. It was all just straightforward, which is, look, to get to this point in time, so the universe is moving, is having displacement. So to get to this point in time, if you're saying there's an infinite path to this, we'd never reach this point in time. There'd be actually no movement, full stop. I could cite some of Greek philosophers like Zeno who tried to argue that movement was impossible because he actually believed that the universe was infinite, and so therefore what you're seeing is actually of movement is an illusion because movement can't happen, because for anything to move it has to move an infinite amount of infinitesimally small spaces, so it can't move then. because your arrow will move from A to B, and how can that be? So this is
dividing,
Zeno's paradoxes, and the very fact that you have movement then actually would disprove Zeno in essence, because what you're seeing is that there is actually not an infinite amount of past beforehand. There must have been a start point, much like I know that the pond is being the water is being held up at a certain level, much that I know that I need another argument, which is that if you saw a branch attached to a tree trunk, you wouldn't have to see how long or how big the tree is to know that it ended somewhere. Not because I've seen other trees, but because what's holding the branch at that particular height, or at least not particular height, but what's holding the branch full stop, right? It has to be at some point something that's keeping it from falling down. And likewise, I could use examples, and I did during that debate on when I said because there were students in the audience, I thought I'd use an example that would resonate with them. So I said, look, if I was poor and I needed £1, and I asked a poor student, and he also didn't have £1, and he asked his another student, she didn't have £1, and so on and so forth. Even if I brought an infinite amount of poor students, I wouldn't get a £1 until you had a non-poor student, let's say, having £1, let's just say, who said, well, actually, I have a £1 here. I can now lend it to that person, who lended that person, and that person eventually gets to me. So it has to be started somewhere, right? That chain of lending must begin. So in essence, in all things, infinite regress fallacy is what I call it, where you an atheist or anyone might claim that infinite past is okay or can exist, and say, well, it can't, because we would never reach this point. There would be no movement, there'd be no change, and there would be no properties of anything, because if an atom gets its properties because it's made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and then they're made out of smaller subatomic particles, and then you get to quarks and bosons and so on and so forth, and leptons and so on, and then you get, and I used that during the discussion. I said, even for the sake of argument, superstrings or quantum vacuum fluctuations, right? Let's just say, virtual particles and so on and so forth. Say that, let's assume that they do exist, and this has been proven and demonstrated and shown any which way. What are they then made out of? What will give them their properties? So he said, look, we don't know what they're made out of. And I said, well, I'm not saying I know what they're made out of either. I'm merely saying that even if there's 10 more smaller things that comprise these things, it ends somewhere. There has to be a substratum, an ultimate point.
Same with the pool example. Doesn't. We don't know the depth, but we know it's there. Yeah,
and in essence, then ultimately, what is actually maintaining all matter and all energy? What is maintaining this? We can only be something that is not itself can't be divided further. And is not, because anything that has dimensions and limits can be cut further. One of Zeno's paradoxes again. So it has to end at some point with actually it's being maintained by something which is not finite, not limited. And that's basically one of my kind of 4 arguments I made. I made kind of 4 arguments. Some people could say they're versions of the contingency argument. They're kind of, you could say, 4 expressions of contingency. So the universe, I picked 4 of the main expressions of contingency in the universe, which is movement, which is the existence of matter itself. So what does, what is it, or let's just say, what is it made out of? What is things made out of? The third argument, which is limitations, that things have limitations. What gave it those limitations? And the 4th one is specificity, which is the particular limitations. And that, people get confused with those last 2. So just to kind of explain, it's like saying, okay, you have a phone there. It's an object. What made that object? That's what gave its limitations. And then the specificity is what gave that phone the color black or the color gray? Why not a different color? Understand? So there's a question: what made the object? And then what gave it, or what determined its very specific attributes against other possibilities. Something has to make a decision on that. Right. Has to make a decision. And again, I was expecting Alex to come back at me and saying, well, you could have randomness, maybe there's chaos. And then I would counter that by saying, well, you can't have chaos or randomness, because in essence, what we call chaos is just a complexity beyond our simple minds to kind of understand very, very intuitively. So something is like, all the atoms in this room, the air atom, they're moving around. And if you knew their positions, you could roughly calculate what they would do using, let's say, Newtonian mechanics. I know there's a quantum world, but we can get into that. But in essence, If we knew that, we could explain it. But to kind of make a mental model of this, our minds are not,
of course,
don't have enough RAM to make that. And so it might as well be chaos to us, or rolling a dice. It might as well be chaos to us. But it actually can be determined by very specific measurements, which you can make if you knew all the variables, right? Yeah. So there is no such thing as real chaos. And I know people try to use the example in the quantum world of radioactive decay, despite the fact that radioactive decay follows certain stochastic laws, meaning different, let's say, elements which are radioactive, they have a kind of consistent half-life. So we can't predict which particular atom will decay in a block of them, but we know that by a certain amount of time, which seems to be quite fixed, half of them will decay, right? So they say, oh, that's random, we can't predict it. And I say, you're making an assumption here because you don't know what random is, and you can't define random, and you don't know what's causing it. I mean, ultimately, we'd say that whether it's it's some other kind of mechanism happening that we can't see it as of yet, or ultimately it is God's will determining it. There's no such thing as true randomness. Yeah. And so these are the kind of arguments this was where I thought the debate would be going towards.
Well, you would expect that, because I saw very clearly in the debate that you began off with a very clear, precise, I mean, it wasn't like a Gillip gash. It wasn't just like machine gun, right? It was like, okay, here's our argument. And it just wasn't addressed. And it kind of reminded me of, I was thinking about this earlier, that, you go, like you stay up all night, there's a big fight happening, and you get the popcorn ready, you get the boys ready, and it's just so one-sided. You're just like, was this really worth?
See, there's a UFC fan here.
Not UFC, but it's just that thing that, because of course we're doing the debate at Oxford in front of Oxford students, and I would have expected this sort of discussion. I mean, one of the things which I said to Hijab, I think before the debate, is I saw Alex and Colin speaking outside, and I just had this feeling like, I don't think these guys have met before. And then when I actually saw the debate, I was like, I really don't think these guys came together and they actually discussed what the strategy was. And if you remember before the debate,
disagreed, I think, at one point with regards to
it was a small disagreement on it's a necessary condition or sufficient condition about prophecies or something like this. But I could be wrong about that. But for me, it was kind of like, if you remember before the debate, there was a discussion between you and Hijab. You came together. Okay, what we're going to do, we're going to have one argument, and then we're going to defend that. And from their side, I didn't really see any argument. I just saw a very half-hearted attempt to try and attack our argument. So
because the title was "Which Explains Reality Better."
Better, yeah.
It wasn't "How do we know Islam is true?"
Yeah.
How do you know
which they tried to make it into? Yeah.
They tried to make it into. I wanted to keep it on the topic title
because we have very limited time. And
there's limited time, and like there's all kinds of discussions you can have as to what is humane, and is the Sharia barbaric or not, and that kind of. There's 1,000 debates you can have related to topics regarding Islam, but this was a very specific topic, which is what explains reality better, and the main premise is the requirement that there be a creator or initiator for all things and a maintainer for all things. Otherwise, you fall into contradiction otherwise. And that was the main argument we were pushing. And unfortunately, it wasn't really addressed by, I felt anyway, it wasn't addressed by the other side. They tried to use other arguments to kind of evade, or at least suggest they were attempting to evade.
Just buying time, really. I just felt
that premise.
So actually, he could have misunderstood the argument as being kalam, which I really don't expect someone like him to do. Or he was just buying time. And, either of those options, they don't really look good for him at the moment. With Colin, we haven't really said much about him. But I think in this, I sort of felt a bit sorry for Alex, actually. Because, and I think this has got to do a little bit with atheist overconfidence. So it's kind of like us debating a bunch of religious people. It should be a bit of a jolly. And no preparation. And I don't even remember what his opening was about, to be honest. And
it was a lot of it about his recollections of the Muslim countries.
Nothing about reality and atheism. And
not the main points. I mean, he tried to bring up typical atheist tropes during the debate, such as who created God, and so on and so forth. And to which I think I addressed it, and then he seemed to not labor the point anymore when I said, look, we didn't say everything requires creation. We said things that have limitations require creation, because creation is, by definition, and initially in the word their definition, to give finite, limited, to give it its limited attributes, to limit it into existence, right? So if something doesn't have limits, then it doesn't require creation. Of course, the other argument, and the main obvious point, is that we can prove there must be a start point, and so that start point is the creator initiating all things,
right?
And therefore there can't be anything prior to it, because if there was anything prior to God, then that would be the start point, and so on. And we know that there has to be a start point, because then nothing would exist if there was no start point, and therefore that's kind of two arguments. One, that God is not finite, that requires creating, and two, we know for absolute certain that the very fact there's movement and there's existence means there was a start point to movement, a start point to existence, and that is why we know God exists, because he's the answer to that problem that we observe.
Yeah. So what I'd like to end upon is something which I felt was a bit of a paradigm shift for, I think, Muslims and atheists. And that was during the debate when the question came. Actually, I don't remember what the question was. But when you explained how from an Islamic point of view, we regard atheists as just the same as Christians or Hindus or volcano worshippers. I mean, I think for a lot of people took that away, because atheists do try and project this as us free thinkers, rationalists versus all you guys, right? So could you elaborate why you did that, and also that, because obviously you were sort of short for time, maybe elaborate on that point.
Sure. Well, I mean, primarily it was to show that there really is only two positions you can have. Either everyone at some point will use the word infinity to describe reality. So the atheist might say there's an infinite past, or the universe is infinitely big, or what have you, or there's infinite universes or bubble universes, or in a multiverse. So everyone uses the word infinite at some point, the Christian, the Hindu, and so on. So what makes them different to Islamic Tawheed is, if you reduce it down, it's quite simple. We keep the infinite separate from the finite. We don't mix the two. We don't say that statue, that limited, shaped, colored statue,
or the universe
is
itself,
secretly representing a infinite power that we can't see directly, but it must be connected to that statue of a shaped creature, or of a human being, or of a particular human person who they worship, or a mountain, or a volcano in the case of some Pacific Islanders. And of course, if you think about it, I mean, look, a mountain doesn't have any particular personality. Of course, many Pacific Islanders would give it there's a hidden spirit behind it that is all infinite and all powerful and have you. But what they can observe is just a finite object, which they view as giving them life. The lava flows create, fertile sediments, and they grow their crops, they depend on it, right? So really, the atheist's volcano is just the universe. The universe has a life-giving planet in it, which they depend on, of course, and so they posit that as this is the infinite thing, or this doesn't require anything else. This is the thing that is all that exists, has an infinite, eternal past, or depending on what type of atheist position you adopt, made itself or created from nothing, right? Stuff. And this is the kind of, if you think about it, what difference is that between the volcano worshipper who worships a volcano, or one that worships something that in essence is just a bigger volcano, the universe? Yeah. Right. So in essence, and it's not just for volcano worshippers, but also those who worship statues, those who worship humans. It's always a group of people who worship a finite thing, or they consider a finite thing to be secretly infinite. You just can't see it, but has an infinite power or infinite eternal past behind it. Whereas in Islam, we say, look, anything that's finite is not infinite. Infinite means, by definition, not finite. So it should be implied in the Latin word. You can use mahdud or ghair mahdud, or whatever word you want to use in any language, is that don't mix them up. And that is the purity of the Tawheed of Islam, which is don't mix the finite and infinite. Yeah. And the Quran regales us with verse after verse of people imputing finite, limited attributes to God, making assumptions against God without authority, imputing to him limited, like tiredness, he forgets, like his energy is exhausted if he does things. Or if you don't worship him, he's somehow diminished. The Quran rebuts this again and again to show that he is not like the finite. There's nothing like unto him.
Excellent. Yeah, that's true. It kind of reminds me of, you can imagine volcano worshippers telling their kids, oh, this is a volcano, it's amazing, look at its shape, and, taking them out and doing rituals and stuff. And, atheists sort of, they deify the universe. They love watching science documentaries. Not to say that's a bad thing, but, they have their rituals and they have, what's undeniable is that they do actually treat the universe as a god in of itself.
They would say that, well, we don't bow down to, we don't pray to God, so we're not deifying. Or why are you saying we're deifying it? And usually I kind of just point out to them, firstly, they impute it to be somehow infinite, even though they can't see that, or they impute it has its eternality somehow, or that it made itself, or a whole number of things. But primarily, and this is just maybe a natural tendency, unfortunately, is they desire to relate to something that has a persona, that has intentionality behind it. But unlike obviously the Islamic concept of God, whereby we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he wills and chooses things, but we don't understand, he's not like a human being, or he's not anthropomorphized in any way. Many atheists, not all, but many atheists anthropomorphize aspects of science and or the study of the universe. So they'll impute intentionality to material processes, for example, or at least make claims, like, for example, and this was a question that came up during that debate on evolution, and they said, well, why do we see in DNA that DNA replication is, it's imperfect, right? Why you see it's imperfect? And that implies that DNA replication, or DNA, or the forces behind it, they have an intention behind themselves, and they're just not perfect at fulfilling their job. Whereas in the material world, or looking at it from just purely chemistry and physics and so on and so forth, there is no intent. Yeah. They're just carrying out the kind of, which you could say, just the consequences of being in the presence of enzymes and being in presence of bases.
There is no end goal. Yeah.
There's no goal. There's no intent behind it, just this mechanism. Just that in this mechanism, for at least humans anyway, 1 out of every 10 billion replications, you're going to have a fault develop. And even then, the human body has mechanisms by which it seems to find faults and correct them, correct DNA and so on and so forth. But if you're an atheist and you believe there's no intentionality behind the universe,
why would you raise that?
The language they use in many cases implies intentionality. I'll give you a more kind of commonplace one, almost seems very prosaic. So I was studying A-level chemistry, and my teacher was explaining chemical equilibriums. So an equilibrium is basically like, okay, just to explain something. So it's a chemical reaction that goes both ways. Yeah. So let's say you have water inside a cup or a beaker, you close it off. Some of that water will be evaporating into the air and will be kind of gaseous. And some of that water that's already in the air will be reuniting in a way with the water itself, or will just be joining as water as a liquid form. It'll be going both ways. So, and if you heat it up, right? If you heat this up, then more of the water will be obviously going into a gaseous form. But the way the chemistry teacher explained it to us will be that with equilibriums, it desires to minimize the effect of what you're doing. So you're trying to heat it up. It tries to use the reaction that takes up more energy in order to absorb that energy and minimize the effect you're changing upon it. I was like, oh, it has a will. It chooses to do this. This is just a basic explanation of chemical equilibrium. It's a very basic chemistry concept, right? And you'll see this with ideas of truth, and even Alex used the concepts of morality and so on. Well, morality doesn't in essence, it doesn't really exist. All you could argue is taste exists, or preference exists, or motivational forces exist amongst creatures, but not really. Morality itself is an anthropomorphization of the universe. Where does there morality? Where is there justice? Let's not forget other types of anthropomorphization.
Yeah.
So what you'll find is that many aspects of the universe are anthropomorphized. Yeah. And even a very famous atheist, Nietzsche, posited that most of his, let's say, atheist colleagues made the last anthropomorphization, the last great obstacle that they haven't yet overcome, which is they believe in something called truth, which is an anthropomorphization of somehow of reality. That reality can be understood as what we call truth, whereas he believed that no, this is just you anthropomorphizing reality, that there's something that you can discover called truth or knowledge or any of that kind of stuff. So these are the kind of things that you'll find the atheist even anthropomorphizes. So deify, we say, if you call something that's finite, infinite, or eternal, that's a way of deification. But even more specifically, to impute intentionality behind material things, even though they might say, well, we know that equilibriums don't have intent, and we know, but they can't help but use this kind of language. Or I've heard people just say that, look, human consciousness is just the material universe gaining self-awareness. Right? It's like, well, the universe doesn't have self-awareness, right? But the explanation that, well, because we're part of the universe and we're purely material, an assumption, by the way, then we must be the universe trying to understand itself, implying that the universe has some intent or desire. So these are the kind of anthropomorphizations that many atheists fall into. Not all of them, but many do, because they've made this universe their big volcano.
And I think they can't help it. I think we all have a fitrah. We have this sanctification instinct. I mean, even in the Soviet Union, hardcore materialist, atheists, Darwinists, and they used to have statues of Stalin and Lenin, stories about them, and it's just misdirected. For us, it's quite clear that fitrah, that natural disposition, leads to Allah. For them, they'll just deify the universe. Make the universe.
They'll deify the finite, and that's the problem. And that's why our Shahadatain says, La ilaha illallah. There is nothing worthy of worship except God. Redirect that natural intent. Natural intent is not bad or good. It's there given to us to fulfill good if you direct it in the right way, which is that the universe, the creator of this universe, he has intent. The choice he made to make this universe is irada in Arabic. It's his will, it's his intent, and that is where you should find there be intent behind the universe and meaning, in essence.
Absolutely,
right? Not in the finite.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, and I think I learned a lot more in this discussion than I did. In fact, maybe we need to do more of these, because I think really breaking it down and breaking down each idea and the way that. Because we play chess games in our head, right? So they're going to use this argument, we're going to give this rebuttal, and I'm sure you already did this sort of mind map thing before you actually did the debate. But it's good to know the back end, because when people see yourself on YouTube, they just see, okay, right, he's giving a presentation, 20 minutes, he's doing a rebuttal, but they don't understand all of this background information, which is actually, it's the tip of the iceberg, essentially, isn't it? I mean, the arguments that you're giving, they're just like the fruits, but there's a whole matrix behind this. And
you have to also anticipate counter arguments. I mean, some people say, oh, why didn't you talk about how we know Islam is true, the miracle of the Quran, the linguistic miracle of the Quran? I mean, I've given lectures about linguistic miracle of the Quran for about, I think, 6-7 years now. But this debate wasn't about proving Islam is true.
And you don't open up too many avenues as well.
Yeah, because if you open up more doors, so to speak, then there'll be more discussions that we'll be having, and you won't be able to deal with the actual main question, which is
what they try to do.
Yeah, which explains reality better. And I mean, I can't speak for their intent, but it seemed like their let's say, arguments suggested that their strategy was to kind of water down the title. They may even weren't so interested in the title, and they wanted to just immediately talk about things that they find maybe personal issues they have with Islam, the morality aspect being a major key issue, despite the fact we kept reiterating to our kind of opponents there that this is irrelevant, right? Even if you find it completely distasteful, the belief in God that Islam has and the Islamic conception of God, which is different from a Christian's conception of God. So it's not just we believe in God and that explains reality better, but the Islamic conception of God where there is no finitude within him, there's no limitations within him. This is the best explanation, in fact, the only possible explanation for reality without contradictions that were experienced by other belief systems and ideas.
Perfect. So that was a good sign that we need to end. Thank you for coming on the show. We're going to be doing more of these in the future. And if you guys want more videos where we go over the background information about these sort of discussions, then please do leave them in the comments below. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Barakallahu feek.